They sold her for less than the price of a prize horse, though the debt her father owed was substantial enough to ruin 3 generations of his bloodline. Leanne walked toward the weathered white clapboard of the church, the Wyoming sun beating down on the back of her neck like a physical weight. She was 19 years old, and she was terrified, though her face remained a mask of porcelain stillness. She did not wear the white lace and cotton typical of the frontier brides. Instead, she was dressed in the red cheong sam her grandmother had stitched in a province far across the ocean, a garment meant for joy, but now serving as a beacon of her isolation. The silk, vivid as fresh blood against the dusty beige of the high desert, clung to her frame, marking her as distinct, foreign, and entirely vulnerable. Mr. Greaves, the man who had brokered this transaction to settle the gambling debts of a dead man, gripped her elbow with bruising force. His fingers dug into the tender flesh of her arm, steering her not like a woman about to be wed, but like livestock being driven into a pen. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Townsfolk had gathered near the entrance, their whispers loud and sharp, cutting through the heavy summer air. They had come to see the spectacle of the foreigner being handed over to the recluse of the valley. Leanne kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching the hem of her red silk brush against the dirt, staining the embroidery. She expected cruelty. Her life in the mining camp had taught her that men were creatures of appetite and rage, and she had been sold to a man known only for his silence and his size. Greaves shoved her forward, and she stumbled over the threshold of the church. The interior was dimmer but stiflingly hot, the air stagnant and smelling of old wax and stale incense. At the altar, a shadow waited. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and still as the stone cliffs that bordered the territory. He did not turn as the doors groaned shut behind them, sealing her fate. She could feel the pulse hammering in her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the end of her life, she was certain. This was where she disappeared. Greaves marched her down the short aisle, the sound of her soft slippers lost beneath the heavy thud of his boots. The priest, a thin man with a sheen of sweat on his upper lip, looked nervous, his eyes darting between Greaves and the large man waiting at the altar. When they reached the front, Greaves finally released her arm, leaving red, distinct marks on her skin. "Here she is," Greaves said, his voice grating and loud in the quiet space. "Debt paid in full, Declan. She's yours. A virgin, as agreed. Does what she's told, mostly." The words hung in the air, stripping her of humanity, reducing her to an object of barter. Leanne held her breath, waiting for the man named Declan Thorne to speak, to inspect her, to confirm the purchase. Slowly the man turned. He was even larger than he appeared from behind, wearing a dusty coat and a dark shirt buttoned to his throat, despite the heat. His face was weathered, etched with lines of hard labor, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetual look of severity. But when his eyes met hers, they were not filled with the lust or malice she had prepared herself for. They were dark, unreadable, and startlingly tired. He looked at Greaves, then down at Leanne, his gaze lingering on the bruises forming on her arm where Greaves had held her. He said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the priest cleared his throat nervously. The ceremony was a blur of Latin and English that Leanne barely comprehended, her mind racing with scenarios of escape that she knew were impossible. She was miles from anywhere, in a land that was hostile to her kind, bound to a stranger. When the time came for the rings, there were none. Declan simply nodded at the priest to continue. He did not take her hand. He stood beside her, a towering wall of heat and presence, but he did not touch her. The absence of his touch was more terrifying than a grip would have been. It felt like the calm before a violent storm. Greaves watched with a sneer, clearly disappointed by the lack of drama, expecting a show of dominance that Declan refused to perform. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the priest rushed out, closing his Bible with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. "You may go." There was no kiss. Declan finally moved, turning his body fully toward her. For a moment, Leanne flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively. Declan paused, his hand halfway extended. He saw the flinch. He saw the terror in her dark eyes. His hand dropped back to his side. "Come," he said. His voice was deep, scraping like gravel, but the tone was not angry. It was merely a statement. He turned and walked down the aisle, his strides long and heavy. He did not drag her. He did not wait for her. He simply walked, assuming she would follow because she had nowhere else to go. And she did, the red silk rustling softly, following the man who now owned her life. Outside, the sun was blinding. The crowd had dispersed somewhat, bored by the quick and quiet ceremony, but a few lingered to watch them leave. Declan climbed onto the seat of a buckboard wagon, the wood bleached gray by the relentless sun. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, but he didn't shout at her to hurry either. Leanne climbed up the side, her movements stiff with dread, settling onto the hard wooden bench as far away from him as the seat allowed. He flicked the reins, and the two large bays lurched forward, pulling them away from the church, away from the town, and out into the vast, empty scrubland. The journey was agonizingly silent. The heat radiated off the ground in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon. Dust kicked up by the horse's hooves coated her skin and the vibrant red of her dress, muting its color, making her look like a ghost of the woman she had been an hour ago. She stole glances at him. His profile was rigid, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. His hands, large and scarred, held the reins with an easy competence. He was a man capable of violence. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the coiled strength in his arms. But he remained completely silent. He didn't ask her name. He didn't tell her the rules of his house. He didn't gloat about the bargain he had struck. The silence began to grate on her nerves, twisting her fear into a sharp, nauseating knot in her stomach. Why didn't he speak? Was he savoring the anticipation? Was he planning something so terrible that words were unnecessary? The landscape grew wilder, the flat plains giving way to rocky foothills and dense patches of pine. They were climbing higher, moving into isolation so profound that if she screamed, the sound would simply be swallowed by the trees. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, a beautiful backdrop for a nightmare. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through her spine. She clutched her hands together in her lap, her knuckles white. She thought of her father, of the debt, of the way Greaves had looked at her. She thought of the stories the other women whispered in the camp, stories of brides who vanished, of men who treated wives like mules. She prepared herself to endure. That was her strength. She could endure pain. She could lock her mind away in a safe place while her body suffered. She had survived the journey across the ocean. She had survived the poverty of the camp. She would survive this, whatever this was. They arrived at the homestead as twilight settled over the valley. It was a modest cabin, built of sturdy logs, with a barn and a corral off to the side. It wasn't the hovel she had expected, nor was it a grand estate. It was utilitarian, clean, and utterly lonely. A porch wrapped around the front, empty of chairs or decoration. Declan pulled the wagon to a halt near the front steps. The horses blew out breaths of exhaustion, their sides heaving in the cooling air. For the first time in hours, Declan looked at her. The shadows obscured his expression, making him loom even larger. "Wait here," he said. It was an order, but again, the tone lacked the bite of cruelty. He jumped down, his boots crunching in the gravel, and walked around to her side of the wagon. Leanne braced herself, her breath hitching. This was it. This was the moment he would pull her down and drag her inside. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid as stone. She felt the wagon shift as he reached up, but no hands grabbed her waist. No rough fingers tangled in her hair. Instead, she heard the thud of wood on the ground. She opened her eyes. He had lifted her small wooden trunk, her only worldly possessions, from the back of the wagon and set it on the dirt. He stood back, giving her space to climb down on her own. He was watching her, his brow furrowed slightly, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Leanne scrambled down, her legs trembling so badly she almost fell. She caught herself on the wheel, expecting him to laugh or scold her clumsiness. He did neither. He simply picked up the trunk with one hand, as if it weighed nothing, and walked toward the cabin door. "Inside," he said over his shoulder. She followed, her heart pounding against her ribs like a hammer. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. He stepped in, and she followed him into the belly of the beast. He set the trunk down and moved to a table, striking a match. The flare of light was blinding for a second before he touched it to a kerosene lamp. The golden glow washed over the room, revealing a space that was surprisingly tidy. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that radiated a faint heat, and a narrow cot in the corner. Leanne stood by the door, hugging her arms around herself. She was waiting for the violence. It was night now. They were alone. The transaction was complete. This was when a husband claimed his rights. She watched him, her eyes wide and dark, tracking his every movement. Declan hung his hat on a peg near the door. He ran a hand through his hair, which was dark and matted with dust. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the church. The lamp cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the scar and the exhaustion in his eyes. He took a step toward her, and she took a step back, her back hitting the wooden door. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Declan stopped immediately. He raised both hands, palms out, in a gesture of surrender. It was so unexpected that Leanne blinked, confused. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words were low, rough, but clear. He lowered his hands slowly. "You think I bought you." It wasn't a question. "Greaves, he talks too much." Declan turned away from her, walking toward a second door at the back of the main room. He pushed it open. "This is your room," he said, gesturing into the darkness beyond. Leanne stared at him, unable to comprehend. Her room? She didn't move. He sighed, a sound of deep weariness. He walked into the small room, struck another match, and lit a second lamp. He returned to the doorway. "Go look," he said. Hesitantly, she moved away from the safety of the front door, creeping toward the room he indicated. She peered inside. It was small, clean. There was a bed with a quilt, a wash basin on a stand, and a window with a sturdy latch. It was a room for a person, not a cell for a prisoner. She looked back at him, confusion warring with fear. "I don't understand," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was trembling. Declan looked at her, his expression stoic, unreadable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. He walked over to the door of the bedroom, inserted the key into the lock from the inside, and turned it. Then he pulled the key out and held it out to her. "The lock works," he said, "from the inside. You keep the key." Leanne stared at the piece of iron in his large palm. It was cold, heavy, and real. He was giving her the means to lock him out. He was giving her a barrier. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Declan placed the key on the small table beside the door when she didn't take it. He stepped back, putting distance between them again. "Because I didn't buy a wife," he said, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I paid a debt so a girl wouldn't be destroyed by it. You sleep there. I sleep out here. You don't come out unless you want to. You don't speak unless you want to. He turned his back on her then, walking toward the stove to add wood. There's water in the pitcher, food in the pantry. Sleep. He didn't look at her again. He just stood there, staring at the fire he was building. Leanne looked at the key, then at his broad back. Her hands shook as she picked up the key. She retreated into the room, closing the door softly. She turned the key in the lock. The click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She waited, her ear pressed to the wood, expecting him to roar, to break it down, to reveal it was all a cruel game. But there was only silence, and the faint sound of a man settling into a chair in the other room, alone. The first light of dawn did not wake her. The silence did. Leanne opened her eyes, her heart immediately hammering against her ribs as the memory of the previous day crashed over her. She was in the stranger's house. She was married. She lay still under the rough cotton quilt, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening for the heavy tread of boots or the sound of angry breathing. There was nothing but the morning birds calling out in the sagebrush. Slowly she sat up, her eyes darting to the door. The key was still in the lock, turned horizontally just as she had left it. He had not tried to enter. The handle had not jiggled in the night. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cool against her bare feet. The red silk Cheong Sam, now wrinkled and stained with the dust of the trail, hung over the back of the single chair in the room. She put it on, the familiar fabric offering a small, pathetic armor against this alien world. She turned the key. The metal mechanism groaned, a harsh sound in the quiet house. She held her breath, waiting for a reaction from the other room, but none came. With trembling fingers, she pulled the door open a crack. The main room was empty. The morning sun sliced through the windows in sharp, dusty beams, illuminating the floating motes in the air. The cot in the corner where he must have slept was neatly made, the blanket pulled tight. The stove was cold, though a fresh pot of coffee sat on top of it, still warm to the touch. He was gone. Panic flared, hot and sudden. Had he abandoned her? But no, that made no sense. He had paid for her. Men did not discard expensive purchases so easily. She stepped fully into the room, her movements soundless. On the table he had left a plate covered with a cloth. She lifted it. 2 biscuits and a strip of cured meat. It wasn't a meal served with love, but it was sustenance provided with thought. She ate standing up, her eyes fixed on the front door, ready to bolt back to her room at the first sign of movement. The food settled the gnawing ache in her stomach, and with the hunger abated, a new feeling took root, a need to be useful. In the mining camp, useless mouths were not fed. If she did not work, she had no value. If she had no value, she was in danger. She looked around the cabin. It was tidy, but dust gathered in the corners, and the floor was streaked with mud. She found a broom in the corner and a bucket by the door. She worked for hours, the repetitive motion of sweeping and scrubbing grounding her. She found a sack of rice in the pantry, a surprising discovery that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion, and set a pot to boil on the stove after struggling to light the wood. She was on her knees, scrubbing the floorboards near the entrance, when the shadow fell across the threshold. Leanne froze, her hands slick with soapy water, her head bowing instinctively. She did not look up as the heavy boots stepped inside. Declan stopped. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and silent. He didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the bubbling of the pot on the stove. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. His voice was just as she remembered, low, gravelly, devoid of anger. She kept her eyes on the wet wood. "I must," she whispered. "I eat your food." He walked past her, his presence like a physical wall moving through the room. He went to the stove, sniffing the air. "Rice," he murmured. He turned to look at her, crouching down so he wasn't towering over her. It was a gesture of accommodation she hadn't expected. "Get up, Leanne." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his accent, the vowels elongated, but not disrespectful. She stood slowly, wringing her hands in her apron. "You are not a servant," he said, his eyes searching hers, "and you are not a prisoner. If you clean because you live here, not to pay me back." The days bled into a rhythm that was as predictable as it was terrifyingly fragile. Summer in the territory was a brutal physical thing. The heat was a weight that pressed down from a cloudless blue sky, drying the earth until it cracked. Leanne learned the boundaries of her new world. She learned that the creek ran cold and clear 100 yards from the house, and that the horses, massive beasts that terrified her, would nuzzle her palm if she offered them apple peels. She learned that Declan spoke rarely, his words rationed like water in a drought. He would leave before dawn to tend the herd or mend fences, and return only when the sun was bleeding into the western horizon. They ate dinner in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks on tin plates. He never touched her. He never crossed the threshold of her room. At night she locked her door, and he slept on the cot. It was a strange, suspended existence, a marriage of ghosts living in the same house. But the fear began to change, morphing from sharp terror into a watchful curiosity. Who was this man who possessed the strength to crush her, but the restraint to leave her be? One afternoon the heat broke with a violent suddenness. Clouds the color of bruised plums rolled over the mountains, bringing a wind that whipped the sagebrush flat against the earth. Leanne was in the garden patch Declan had tilled for her, trying to save the struggling tomato plants from the gale, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. They were fast, aggressive, not the rhythmic trot of Declan's horse. She stood up, shielding her eyes against the stinging dust. A rider appeared over the ridge, a man she didn't know, wearing a long duster and a hat pulled low. He wasn't Declan. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She dropped her basket and ran toward the house, but the wind was against her. The rider saw her. He whooped, a high, ugly sound, and spurred his horse toward her, cutting off her path to the porch. He reined the horse in hard, the animal rearing slightly, hooves churning the dirt just feet from where she stood frozen. "Well now," the stranger shouted over the wind, his teeth yellow in a bearded face. "Greaves said the recluse bought himself a china doll, but I didn't believe it." Leanne backed away, her heart battering against her ribs. She looked toward the barn, but Declan was miles away, checking the south fence. She was alone. The man swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. He grinned, stepping toward her. "You don't look like much," he sneered, looking her up and down in a way that made her feel naked. "Cost a lot, did you? Maybe I should see if he got his money's worth." He reached for her. Leanne scrambled back, tripping over the hem of her dress, falling hard onto the dirt. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. But the laugh died in his throat. A crack echoed through the wind, sharp, unmistakable. A bullet kicked up the dirt less than an inch from the stranger's boot. Leanne gasped, turning her head. Declan stood on the porch, his rifle raised, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He had returned early. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply worked the lever of the rifle, chambering another round. "Get on your horse," Declan said. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind like a knife. The stranger held up his hands, backing away, his bravado evaporating instantly in the face of Declan's stillness. "Just being neighborly, Thorne," the man stammered. "Get on your horse." Declan didn't blink. The man scrambled into his saddle and galloped away without looking back. Declan lowered the rifle. He didn't watch the man leave. He looked at Leanne, still on the ground. He set the rifle against the rail and walked down the steps, extending a hand. This time she didn't flinch. She took it. His grip was rough, calloused, and incredibly warm. He pulled her to her feet, his eyes scanning her for injury. "Go inside," he said softly. "Storm's coming." That evening the storm raged against the cabin, rain lashing the windows like handfuls of gravel. The temperature had plummeted, and Declan had built a fire in the stove that roared with comforting heat. The incident with the stranger hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy. Leanne sat at the table, mending a tear in one of his shirts. Her hands were steady now. The fear that usually sat in her throat had receded, replaced by something warmer, something that felt dangerously like trust. Declan sat opposite her, cleaning the rifle. The smell of gun oil and wood smoke filled the room. He moved with a precision that was hypnotic, his large hands dismantling the deadly mechanism with gentle efficiency. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He had simply ensured she was safe. That action spoke louder than any poetry she had ever heard. She looked up from her sewing, watching the firelight play across the scar on his forehead. "Why?" she asked. The word was soft, barely audible over the rain, but Declan's hands stopped moving. He didn't look up immediately. He slid the bolt back into place with a metallic click. "Why what?" he asked, his voice low. "Why did you spend the money?" Leanne asked, her English halting but clear. "You do not want a wife. You do not touch me. You do not want service. That was much money. For nothing." Declan set the rifle down on the table and finally met her gaze. His eyes were dark pools, reflecting the flames. He looked tired, an ancient weariness that went down to his bones. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "I had a wife," he said. The confession hung in the air. Leanne stayed very still. "Years ago, before I came here." He looked at his hands, turning them over as if reading a map in the calluses. "She was in debt. Not money. Trouble. I could have helped her. I hesitated. I thought there was more time." He looked at the window where the rain was a black sheet against the glass. "There wasn't. She died because I didn't act." He turned his gaze back to Leanne, and the intensity of it took her breath away. "I saw you in that church. I saw the way Greaves held your arm. I saw the look in your eyes." He paused, searching for the words. It was the same look she had. Fear. "And I had the money this time. I didn't buy you, Leanne. I bought my own peace. I couldn't watch it happen again." He stood up abruptly, the vulnerability of the moment seemingly too much for him. "It wasn't for you," he said, his voice gruff again, retreating behind his walls. "It was for me. Selfish." He walked to the stove to pour coffee, his back to her. Leanne watched him. He called it selfish. She called it salvation. She stood up and walked to the stove, stopping just behind him. She didn't touch him, but she stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from his back. "Thank you," she said. He stiffened slightly, then relaxed. "Go to sleep," he said. "You're safe here." And for the first time in her life, she believed it. The peace they had built was shattered 2 weeks later. The summer heat had returned with a vengeance, baking the mud from the storm into concrete. Leanne was in the kitchen kneading dough when the dogs Declan kept for the sheep began to bark, a frantic, vicious barking that signaled a threat. She wiped her floury hands on her apron and went to the window. 3 riders were approaching the cabin. In the lead was Greaves. He rode with an arrogance that made Leanne's stomach churn. Behind him were 2 men, one of whom was the stranger Declan had chased off. They were armed. Declan was in the corral breaking a new colt. He saw them coming. He dismounted smoothly, not rushing, and walked to the fence where his rifle rested. He picked it up and walked to meet them in the yard, placing himself between the riders and the house. Leanne's heart hammered. She looked at the back door. She could run. She could flee into the hills while they were distracted. That was what a survivor did. That was what she had been taught. Save yourself. "Afternoon, Declan," Greaves shouted, reining in his horse. He didn't dismount. "We got a problem." Declan stood his ground, the rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. "No problem here, Greaves, unless you're bringing one." Greaves laughed, but his eyes were cold. "See, I've been looking over the books. Turns out the old man's debt. There was interest. Compound interest. You're short, Declan. About $500 short." It was a lie. A blatant, extortionist lie. "The deal is done," Declan said, his voice hard as iron. "She's my wife. Get off my land." Greaves signaled to the men behind him. They unholstered their pistols. "She's property until the debt is cleared," Greaves sneered. "And since you can't pay, we're here to repossess. I got a buyer in San Francisco who pays in gold." Declan shifted his stance, the rifle barrel rising slightly. "You'll die trying," he said. "Maybe," Greaves shrugged, "but so will you, and then we take her anyway." The tension snapped. One of the men raised his gun. Declan was faster. He fired from the hip, the shot hitting the dirt near the horse's feet, spooking the animal. But there were three of them. Greaves leveled his revolver at Declan's chest. "Drop it, Declan. I don't want to kill you, but I will." Declan didn't move. He was going to die. He was going to die for her. Leanne looked at the heavy iron key on the table. She looked at the back door. Then she looked at the shotgun hanging above the mantel, the one he had showed her how to load, just in case of wolves. She didn't think. She moved. She grabbed the heavy weapon, the wood smooth against her cheek, and kicked the front door open. "Greaves!" she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and furious. The men turned, startled. She stood on the porch, the shotgun leveled at Greaves's chest. She was shaking, but the gun was steady. "Leave," she commanded. "Leave or I kill you." Greaves looked at her, then at the massive bore of the shotgun. He looked at Declan, who had used the distraction to aim his rifle directly at Greaves's head. The balance of power had shifted. They could kill Declan, but Leanne would kill Greaves first. The gambler did the math. He sneered, holstering his gun. "Crazy bitch," he muttered. "Keep her then. She's not worth the bullet." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's go." They watched until the dust cloud from the riders disappeared over the ridge. Declan didn't lower his rifle until they were gone. Then he turned to look at the porch. Leanne was still standing there, the shotgun heavy in her arms, her chest heaving. She felt like she might vomit. She had almost killed a man. She had chosen to fight. Declan walked toward her. He climbed the steps slowly. He reached out and gently took the shotgun from her trembling hands, setting it aside. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else. Respect. "You could have run," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "You had time." Leanne looked up at him, her chin trembling but high. "I am not property," she said, her voice shaking. "I am wife." The word felt heavy, significant. "And you," she struggled for the words, "you stood." Declan looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had never done. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was shaking slightly, too. "Yeah," he said thickly. "I stood." The next morning the air was crisp, the heat of the summer beginning to fade into the promise of autumn. Declan hitched the wagon. He packed her trunk, the same small wooden trunk she had arrived with, and placed it in the back. He put on his coat and hat. Leanne stood on the porch watching him. Confusion swirled in her gut. The danger was gone. Why was he packing? He walked up the steps and stopped in front of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is a ticket," he said. "Train to the coast. And money. Enough to start over." He held it out to her. "You're free, Leanne. Greaves won't come back. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to be a debt paid." Leanne looked at the envelope. It was freedom. It was what she had dreamed of every night since she was 12. She could go where no one knew her name. She could be alone. She looked at the ticket, then she looked at the cabin. She looked at the garden she had planted, the tomato plants struggling but surviving in the harsh soil. She looked at Declan. He was waiting, his face stoic, prepared to let her go, prepared to return to his silence and his ghosts. He was giving her the choice he never had. He was giving her dignity. Leanne reached out and took the envelope. Declan's shoulders slumped slightly, a microscopic defeat. Then Leanne walked over to the stove. She opened the iron door to the firebox and tossed the envelope inside. The paper caught instantly, curling into black ash. Declan stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "Leanne," he breathed. "Why?" She turned to him. She didn't smile, but her eyes were clear, the fear gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "I do not want to go," she said. "I choose." She walked past him to the table where the heavy iron key still sat. She picked it up. She walked to her bedroom door, inserted the key, and turned it. Unlock. She pulled the key out and placed it in her pocket. Then she left the bedroom door wide open. She turned back to him. "I choose this," she said. "I choose us." Declan stood frozen, the realization washing over him. The walls he had built, the silence he had lived in, crumbled. He took a step toward her. He didn't rush. He walked to her and took her hands in his. "Okay," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Okay." Outside, the wind blew through the sagebrush, no longer a lonely sound, but a song of the frontier. They stood together in the quiet house, no longer strangers, no longer a debt and a payer, but two survivors who had found a home in the unlikeliest of places.